The millionaire was a man who seemed to have everything anyone could ever want. He lived in a huge mansion perched on the edge of a beautiful hill, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, sparkling fountains, and tall, elegant gates that kept the outside world at a distance. Every morning, he woke up to the soft sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows and the gentle sound of birds chirping in the trees. He had a life of comfort, filled with expensive cars, luxurious clothes, and a staff who anticipated his every need. But despite all this, he was a man who liked order, cleanliness, and control. His daily routine was carefully planned. From the moment he woke up, his personal assistant would bring him his favorite breakfast, freshly prepared exactly the way he liked it, followed by a quick inspection of his vast estate. The millionaire prided himself on knowing every corner of his home, every detail of the furniture, and even the exact layout of his garden. He believed that a clean, organized life was a safe life, and that by controlling his surroundings, he could avoid surprises. He was also known for his keen business mind, building an empire from scratch through smart decisions and calculated risks. His friends admired him, his colleagues respected him, and his employees feared him just enough to follow his rules without question. Yet, despite all his success, there was one thing he never liked to admit: he was afraid of losing control, and the thought of anything unexpected happening in his perfectly maintained life made him uneasy. One sunny morning, as he strolled through the mansion's grand hallway, examining the gleaming floors and polished surfaces, he noticed something strange. A small movement near one of the antique chairs caught his eye. At first, he thought it was nothing, maybe just a shadow or a trick of the sunlight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. It bothered him more than he cared to admit, because in his world, even a tiny imperfection was unacceptable. He had always relied on his staff to handle the small problems, whether it was dust, pests, or repairs, but this time, there was something different, something that seemed almost alive. He frowned and muttered to himself, wondering if the mansion had somehow been invaded by insects. It wasn't unusual for large estates to attract pests, but he had always believed his home was too pristine for anything to survive. He had the best cleaning crew, regular inspections, and the finest security systems. Yet he felt a shiver of unease. Despite his discomfort, he continued his morning routine, visiting the study, the library, and the indoor garden, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But the feeling of being watched, of something crawling just out of sight, lingered in his mind. His luxurious life, full of beauty and wealth, suddenly felt fragile, as if a tiny mistake or overlooked detail could unravel the perfection he had worked so hard to maintain. His maid, a sharp and observant woman who had been working for him for several years, noticed the subtle change in his behavior. She knew that when the millionaire was uneasy, something serious was happening. Unlike the usual small complaints about dust or misplaced items, she quietly prepared herself to investigate. Sensing that the problem was bigger than he thought, her attention to detail had always impressed the millionaire, though he rarely acknowledged it, and today, her vigilance would prove crucial. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the polished floors, the millionaire tried to ignore the growing tension in his chest. He walked past the grand staircase, past the priceless paintings, past the elegant chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. Yet, no matter how much he focused on the beauty around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his control. The thought made him uneasy, because in his world, unexpected events were unacceptable, and yet, here he was, facing the unknown. It was a life of luxury, comfort, and endless possibilities, but it was also a life built on order, control, and routine. The millionaire had always believed that money could solve any problem, that wealth could protect him from surprises, but deep down, he knew that even the richest man could face a moment of helplessness, and today, he was about to discover just how fragile his perfect life could be. The morning had begun like any other in the millionaire's mansion, yet there was an unusual tension lingering in the air. Something seemed off, almost imperceptible, but enough to make even the most confident man pause. As he walked through the grand hallway, he noticed a small, quick movement near the corner of the room. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow playing across the polished floor, but the movement repeated, deliberate and impossible to ignore. He squinted, leaning closer, trying to identify what it could be. Just insects, he muttered to himself, trying to brush away the rising unease. He had dealt with pests before, nothing serious, and yet something about this felt different. the hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he realized the movement wasn't like any insect he had ever seen. It was subtle, almost intelligent in its motion, as if the object or creature was aware it was being watched. Deciding not to panic, he called his maid, the only person he trusted implicitly in his household. "Go and check the room," he said, his voice calm but tight with hidden worry. The maid, a woman of sharp instincts and quiet confidence, stepped forward, her eyes scanning every inch of the floor, walls, and furniture. She had worked in this mansion for years, and nothing escaped her notice. Today, however, she felt a chill run down her spine, an unusual sensation that told her this was not ordinary. She crouched near the corner where the movement had been spotted, carefully inspecting the area. Her hands hovered over the polished wooden floor, not daring to touch too quickly. Every detail mattered, the smallest scratch, the tiniest shadow, the faintest sound. The millionaire watched over her shoulder, his pulse quickening as he waited for her reaction, expecting her to dismiss it as insects, as he had. But she didn't dismiss it. Her eyes widened in shock as she leaned closer, noticing details that the millionaire hadn't. Something was undeniably wrong. Her sharp mind immediately recognized that this was not a simple pest problem, not in this mansion, not with this level of cleanliness. The movement was deliberate, almost sinister, and she could feel an overwhelming sense of danger in the room. The millionaire noticed her reaction and felt a cold shiver. He tried to peer over her shoulder, to see what she was seeing, but her expression was too intense, too fearful. She whispered, almost to herself, "This isn't what it seems." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the seriousness of her discovery. The millionaire's heart raced, a mixture of disbelief and fear clawing at him. He stepped closer, trying to maintain control, but the atmosphere of the room had already shifted. The mansion that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt ominous, as if it were holding a secret it had kept hidden for years. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. The tiniest sound seemed amplified, making every movement, every breath, tense and deliberate. The maid continued her careful inspection, moving slowly, deliberately, as if aware that any sudden motion could trigger something unexpected. She crouched lower, her eyes scanning every crack and corner, every shadow. The millionaire could hardly breathe, watching her, waiting for some explanation that would restore normalcy. And then, she noticed it, a detail so small yet so horrifying that it made her gasp aloud. The movement was coming from something that didn't belong, something that shouldn't have survived in the pristine mansion. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossibility. The millionaire leaned closer, demanding to know what she saw, and the tension between curiosity and fear reached a breaking point. The room that had been a symbol of luxury and comfort transformed into a chamber of suspense and dread. Every polished surface, every expensive piece of furniture seemed to hide a secret. The millionaire's confidence faltered, replaced by a sense of helplessness he had never known. The maid's sharp eyes had uncovered a clue, a hint that something far more terrifying than insects was lurking in the mansion. Neither of them could have predicted what was about to be revealed. The tension built with every heartbeat, the suspense thickening as they prepared to face whatever unimaginable truth lay hidden in the shadows. The morning sunlight that once made the room beautiful now seemed harsh, exposing details that had gone unnoticed, and the millionaire realized that this simple assumption of just insects could be the beginning of a nightmare that would change everything. The maid's hands trembled slightly as she leaned even closer to the corner where she had first noticed the movement. Her eyes darted back and forth, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was far beyond a simple pest problem. Something alive, something deliberate, was hidden in the shadows, and it was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her years of service. The millionaire stood behind her, attempting to appear calm, but his anxiety was impossible to hide. He had seen strange things before, minor mishaps, broken furniture, or tiny pests, but nothing had ever unsettled him like this. There was a weight in the room, a pressure that made the air feel thick, and even the faintest sound seemed magnified. The quiet hum of the mansion's ventilation felt intrusive, almost threatening. The maid's eyes widened as she noticed subtle movements near the base of a grand antique cabinet. Something was crawling, something too large and too strange to be ordinary insects. She could see the glint of tiny eyes reflecting the morning light, a sign of life that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the movement was intelligent, purposeful, almost as if whatever was hiding there knew it was being watched. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced through every possibility. But nothing could explain what she was seeing. The millionaire, sensing her fear, leaned closer and asked sharply, "What is it?" She hesitated, her voice barely audible. It's not insects," she whispered, her words hanging in the air like a warning. The millionaire felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, the first real sign that something was terribly wrong. As she moved a little closer, she could see the source of the movement more clearly. A shadow shifted, and then, to her horror, she noticed small, thin appendages emerging from the dark space beneath the cabinet. They moved with a quick, deliberate rhythm, and the sound of tiny scratching echoed faintly across the polished floor. Her stomach churned, and she could feel her hands growing clammy. She had never felt fear like this, a mix of disbelief and terror that froze her in place. The millionaire, noticing her change in expression, tried to step forward, but she held up her hand, signaling him to wait. There was something he needed to see, something he needed to understand. Her sharp eyes caught a detail that made her gasp. Something glimmered, a strange shine that didn't belong in the pristine mansion. She leaned closer, and suddenly, her worst fears were confirmed. Whatever was beneath the cabinet was alive, intelligent, and horrifyingly unnatural. The millionaire's pulse raced as she finally spoke, her voice trembling. "You have to see this for yourself," she said. Her hands shook as she pointed toward the shadow, revealing the creeping movement. The millionaire squinted, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The room, which had always symbolized safety, wealth, and control, now felt like a trap, a cage holding something dangerous and unknown. As he bent down, his eyes widened in shock. The movement wasn't just insects, not even close. There were dozens of small, writhing creatures, their tiny limbs scuttling in unnatural patterns, and their eyes, tiny, glimmering, and intelligent, stared back at him. He could feel a wave of panic rising, realizing that his assumptions about control and safety were completely wrong. His mansion, a symbol of power and wealth, had been hiding something terrifying all along. The maid took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had been right to insist on looking closer. Her vigilance had uncovered a danger that could have gone unnoticed, potentially growing stronger with every passing moment. The millionaire, pale and shaken, struggled to find words. Every ounce of confidence he had built over decades seemed to crumble in an instant. He realized that wealth could not protect him from the unimaginable, and that sometimes, the smallest detail could hold the greatest horror. In that quiet, tension-filled room, time seemed to slow. The sunlight that once filled the mansion with warmth now highlighted the grotesque scene before them. The maid's keen observation had revealed a truth that was almost impossible to believe, and the millionaire could only stare, frozen between fear and disbelief. The room, once a sanctuary of luxury, had become a stage for something beyond comprehension, and the real horror was only beginning to unfold. The millionaire felt his stomach twist as he stared at the creatures beneath the cabinet. Their movement was swift, almost synchronized, and their tiny, glimmering eyes seemed to follow his every motion. He had always prided himself on control, on knowing every corner of his mansion, yet now he realized that control was an illusion. Something completely unpredictable and horrifying had invaded the heart of his home. The maid stepped back slightly, her instincts screaming that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than insects. "We need to be careful," she whispered, her voice tense. "They're not ordinary, and we don't know how many there are." The millionaire nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had always believed that wealth and meticulous planning could solve any problem, but this was beyond money, beyond security systems, beyond reason. He took a cautious step closer, peering into the shadowy corner, trying to gauge the full extent of the threat. The creatures moved with purpose, their tiny limbs scratching and scuttling in a way that made the polished floor feel alive with their presence. Every instinct in his body screamed to retreat, yet his curiosity and disbelief held him frozen. The mansion that had always been a sanctuary now felt like a trap, every wall and hallway closing in with unseen menace. The maid, meanwhile, crouched lower, examining the creatures in detail. Her sharp eyes caught something even more disturbing, a faint glimmer of color on some of the bodies, almost like markings, as if they were part of a system or pattern. She realized with growing dread that this was not random. There was intelligence here, a kind of organization that no ordinary pests could possess. "Look at them," she said softly, pointing, her voice barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The millionaire leaned closer, heart pounding, and finally, he saw it, the creatures were moving in a way that suggested coordination, almost like they were aware of each other, forming groups and scanning the room with uncanny precision. He stepped back sharply, the realization hitting him like a wave. "This isn't just an infestation," he muttered, his voice shaky. This is something else entirely." A chill ran down his spine as he glanced around the room, imagining the possibility that more of these creatures were hiding in other corners of the mansion. The thought made him shiver, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow seemed suspicious now, as if the mansion itself had become an unpredictable battlefield. The maid, sensing his fear, kept her eyes locked on the corner, determined not to let the situation escalate further. She had seen many strange things in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this level of organized, hidden horror. The millionaire, normally calm and commanding, felt a rare vulnerability creep into him. For the first time, he questioned his assumptions about safety, about wealth, about control. All the locks, alarms, and polished surfaces meant nothing against an unseen, intelligent threat that had been quietly hiding within his home. His mind raced, trying to calculate what to do next, but every option seemed insufficient, risky, or downright terrifying. The maid finally spoke again, her voice steadier now, though still tense. "We need help, someone who knows what we're dealing with," she said. The millionaire swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility and fear pressing down on him. He realized that this was not just a momentary problem, it was a situation that could escalate beyond his control, a danger that could threaten the very foundation of his luxurious life. As they both stared at the writhing, coordinated mass beneath the cabinet, a sense of dread settled over the room. It was no longer just a curiosity, a strange movement in the shadows. It was a living threat, intelligent and hidden, something that had escaped detection until now. The mansion that had been his pride and sanctuary suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable, and exposed, and for the first time in his life, the millionaire understood that there were forces far beyond wealth and preparation that could disrupt even the most perfect life. In the tense silence that followed, every small sound became amplified, every movement in the corner felt like a warning. The maid's eyes never left the creatures, her instincts guiding her with precision, and the millionaire felt a shiver of helplessness, realizing that the next few moments could decide the safety of the entire household. The horror of what lay hidden in the shadows was no longer theoretical, it was real, immediate, and terrifyingly close. The tension in the mansion grew heavier with every passing second. The millionaire and his maid stared at the writhing mass beneath the cabinet, realizing that what they were dealing with was far larger and more organized than either of them could have imagined. The creatures were moving with startling coordination, scuttling in patterns that suggested intelligence, and the tiny glimmers of light reflecting off their bodies made the polished floor seem alive. The millionaire's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. He had assumed this was a minor problem, something that could be handled with a simple cleaning or a spray, but now he understood the gravity of the situation. These weren't ordinary insects, not by any measure, and the realization that his entire mansion might be crawling with them made his chest tighten with fear. The maid, her instincts sharper than ever, took a cautious step forward, examining the movement more closely. She noticed clusters of the creatures moving together, almost like they were communicating. She could see the faint shimmer of their tiny limbs, and a chill ran down her spine as she recognized the unnatural intelligence in their behavior. "It's spreading," she whispered, barely audible, yet the words carried the weight of inevitability. The millionaire's eyes widened as he followed her gaze, seeing it for himself. He felt a cold dread settle over him. The creatures weren't confined to the corner anymore, some were moving toward the walls, others disappearing behind furniture, and the thought that they might be hiding throughout the mansion made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. He tried to take control, giving instructions to his staff who had gathered at a safe distance, but his voice sounded strange even to him, wavering under the weight of fear. "We need to clear the room," he said, yet he knew in his heart that they could not fight this alone. The creatures were too small, too fast, too coordinated, and the mansion that had always been a symbol of safety now felt like a trap. The maid crouched closer to the floor, her keen eyes observing every detail. She noticed something alarming, a faint pattern in the way the creatures moved, almost like a system of tunnels or hidden pathways beneath the polished floors. "They know the layout," she murmured, a mixture of awe and terror in her voice. "They know this house better than we do." The millionaire felt his stomach drop, realizing that every step, every corner, could conceal more of these creatures, waiting silently for Their moment. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the weight of helplessness pressed down. The mansion he had spent years perfecting, every room meticulously designed and maintained, had become a dangerous unknown. He looked at his maid, her face pale but determined, and he realized that her courage and sharp instincts might be their only hope, yet, even she seemed overwhelmed by the scale of what they were facing. As they watched, more creatures began to emerge from hidden crevices, tiny but relentless, moving toward areas of the room that had seemed untouched moments before. The millionaire felt a rising panic, imagining the vast network of hidden tunnels and secret corners that could conceal hundreds, even thousands more. The luxury of his home offered no protection here, only exposure to the unknown. The maid motioned for him to stay back, her instincts warning her that sudden movements could provoke the creatures. She carefully studied their behavior, noticing that certain areas of the room were avoided, almost like they had a pattern, a system of territory. Her mind raced to understand what they were capable of, realizing that the problem was far more complex than anything she had ever encountered. The millionaire's thoughts turned to his wealth, his security, his comfort, and he felt a rare vulnerability. He understood, in a chilling moment of clarity, that no amount of money or planning could protect him from the unexpected. The creatures were an unstoppable force of nature, hidden in plain sight, and their presence had transformed the mansion from a place of pride to a place of terror. Together, the millionaire and his maid took cautious steps, trying to contain their fear as they considered their next move. The room was alive with movement, a terrifying reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that even the most luxurious, controlled environment could harbor a nightmare. The horror of the situation was no longer a distant possibility, it was immediate, relentless, and impossible to ignore. And they both knew that the coming hours would determine whether the mansion remained a home or became a prison for the unknown threat lurking within its walls. The mansion was silent except for the faint scratching and scuttling coming from the corners and crevices. The millionaire and his maid stared at the shadows, both holding their breath as if any sound might provoke the creatures into action. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the golden morning light streaming through the windows now seemed cold and harsh, highlighting the polished surfaces that had once made the house feel safe. The maid crouched lower, her sharp eyes tracing every movement, trying to make sense of the organized chaos before her. Something about the creatures' behavior had changed. They were no longer simply moving in random patterns, they were forming lines, almost like a strategy, as if they were aware that someone was watching them. Her heart pounded, and yet a strange determination filled her. She knew she had to understand what she was dealing with before it was too late. As she studied them, she noticed an anomaly. A faint glimmer of something beneath the floorboards caught her eye, something metallic, tiny but deliberate, reflecting light in a way that didn't belong naturally in the room. She leaned closer, careful not to startle the creatures, and saw a network of hidden tunnels beneath the cabinet, their entrances cleverly concealed. Their movement was flowing in and out of these tunnels with purpose, almost like soldiers returning to a hidden base. The millionaire watched in disbelief, feeling a cold sweat on his forehead. His mansion, the pinnacle of control and perfection, was now host to something intelligent, organized, and horrifying. He swallowed hard, struggling to reconcile the image of luxury with the nightmare beneath his floors. This isn't just a pest problem, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The maid nodded, her eyes never leaving the movement. No, sir, she said, this is something far worse, and it's been here longer than we imagined. She reached for a small flashlight from her apron pocket, a tool she had brought for inspecting corners during deep cleaning, and shone the light into the hidden tunnels. Her eyes widened in terror at what she saw. There were dozens of tiny, metallic objects embedded among the writhing creatures, small pins and wires that seemed almost deliberate, like some kind of experiment or manipulation. The creatures themselves moved around them, interacting with the objects as if they were essential to their purpose. The millionaire's pulse quickened, horror twisting in his stomach. He realized the truth slowly, painfully, that these weren't natural creatures at all. They had been altered, engineered, or manipulated in some way, combining living organisms with something mechanical, something designed with intelligence far beyond ordinary life. The thought made him step back, the room suddenly feeling impossibly large and threatening. The maid pointed toward a larger tunnel entrance, one that seemed to disappear into the mansion's foundation. "Look there," she whispered. The millionaire squinted, feeling a surge of panic. The tunnel widened, revealing what seemed like a central hub where the creatures congregated, moving with precision around the metallic objects. It was organized, deliberate, and horrifyingly intelligent, as if the mansion itself had become a laboratory, hiding a living nightmare. He staggered back, suddenly aware of the enormity of what he had assumed were harmless insects. The mansion, a symbol of wealth and power, was nothing compared to the horror now revealed beneath its floors. The maid, sensing his shock, placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "We need help," she said firmly, though her own hands shook slightly. "This is beyond us, and if we wait any longer..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the terrible implication unspoken. The creatures scuttled back into their tunnels as if aware that they had been observed, their metallic accompaniments catching the sunlight in fleeting flashes. The millionaire felt a chill run down his spine, realizing that this nightmare had been hidden in plain sight, controlled and thriving beneath his feet for who knew how long. He had assumed safety, assumed control, assumed perfection, but all of it had been an illusion, shattered in the span of a few moments. For the first time in his life, he understood fear in its purest form, raw and unfiltered. The mansion he had built to symbolize wealth, security, and control was now a cage filled with something alive, intelligent, and terrifying, and the realization struck him with a force he could not deny. His only hope was the maid, her sharp instincts and bravery, but even she seemed to understand the scale of the nightmare. And the question lingered in the air: how deep did it go, and could they ever truly escape the horror hidden beneath the luxury of their surroundings? The millionaire's heart pounded as he stared at the hidden tunnels beneath the cabinet. He felt the weight of helplessness pressing down on him, but he also knew that inaction would be far worse. The maid's eyes never left the writhing creatures, her mind racing as she considered their options. There was no time to waste, no chance to ignore what was happening. The nightmare beneath the mansion demanded immediate attention, and every second felt like a countdown to disaster. "We need to contain them," the maid whispered urgently. "If they spread to other rooms, we could lose control of the entire mansion." The millionaire nodded, swallowing hard, his hands trembling. He had always been a man of power, control, and precision, yet now, confronted with something beyond comprehension, he felt powerless. The creatures moved in and out of the tunnels with unnerving intelligence, almost as if they were anticipating their every decision. The maid gestured to a stack of large, empty containers she had brought for cleaning supplies. "We can try to trap them," she suggested, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes, "but we have to act carefully, or they'll scatter into the walls." The millionaire grabbed a flashlight and followed her instructions, crouching low to avoid startling the creatures. Every movement felt critical, as if a single wrong step could trigger chaos. They began cautiously placing the containers over the creatures, sliding them across the polished floor without making noise. The metallic glints of the engineered appendages reflected the light in eerie flashes, making it almost impossible to keep track of all of them at once. The creatures reacted instantly, scuttling in patterns designed to confuse and evade. Their coordinated behavior suggested an intelligence that far exceeded anything the millionaire had ever seen. The maid's mind raced as she tried to predict their movements, directing him quietly. "Now, push it slowly, don't rush, keep them contained," she instructed. Her focus was razor-sharp, her instincts guiding every motion. The millionaire followed her directions, holding his breath as the creatures darted toward corners and shadows. Their movement was fast, almost too fast for the eye to follow, and yet she anticipated their paths with uncanny accuracy. Suddenly, one of the larger tunnels revealed a group of the creatures moving in formation, their metallic parts glinting like tiny, sinister mirrors. The millionaire froze, realizing that this was no longer a simple containment problem. They were facing a network, a hive of intelligence working as a single unit, and every decision had to be perfect. The maid's eyes narrowed, and she whispered, "We have to block the tunnels, all of them, before they realize we're trying to trap them." They scrambled to find heavy objects to block the entrances, furniture, books, even decorative boxes, dragging them across the floor without making a sound. Every movement sent tremors of anxiety through the millionaire. He felt the surreal terror of his perfect mansion turning into a battlefield, where every corner hid a potential threat. Every second stretched into eternity as the creatures scuttled in precise coordination, slipping past their first attempts at containment. The maid noticed a faint vibration in the floor, a subtle rhythm that suggested more tunnels hidden deeper beneath the mansion. She pointed urgently to a spot near the far wall. There. That's another entrance. The millionaire grabbed a heavy chair, blocking it as carefully as he could. The creatures hesitated for a moment, sensing the obstacle, then continued their coordinated movement, pushing against the makeshift barriers, testing for weaknesses. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to breathe, relying on the maid's expertise. Her calm, precise instructions guided their every action. Each container, each obstacle, each careful placement became a small victory in an overwhelming nightmare. The creatures were relentless, intelligent, and terrifying, but with strategy, patience, and focus, they slowly began to gain the upper hand. By the time they had blocked most of the visible tunnels, the millionaire leaned against the wall, drenched in sweat, his mind racing. He realized that the mansion he had once considered impenetrable and perfect had become a battlefield for survival, and yet, thanks to the maid's courage and sharp instincts, they had a chance. The creatures were trapped, for now, but the question lingered: how many more were hidden? And what unimaginable horrors awaited if even one slipped past their defenses? The room was quiet again, except for the soft scratching of the few creatures still contained. The millionaire looked at the maid with a mixture of awe and relief, understanding that her vigilance, bravery, and quick thinking had prevented a disaster. The mansion, a symbol of wealth and control, had been challenged in a way he could never have anticipated, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time, he felt hope flicker in the shadow of horror. The room was quiet now, the few remaining creatures contained beneath the carefully placed containers and barricades. The millionaire leaned heavily against the wall, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his forehead. He had faced fear before, challenges in business, arguments in meetings, even dangerous situations in far-off countries, but nothing compared to the terror he had just witnessed within the walls of his own mansion. The maid crouched beside him, eyes still scanning the corners and shadows. Her hands shook slightly from the adrenaline, but her focus remained sharp. She had seen enough to understand that while this immediate threat was contained, the true horror had been revealed. The creatures were not random pests, not harmless intruders, but something engineered, intelligent, and potentially endless, hidden beneath the opulence and luxury of a life built on control. The millionaire finally found his voice, trembling yet firm. How did this happen? How long have they been here? He asked. His mind raced, trying to understand the impossible. The maid shook her head slowly. I don't know, sir, she said quietly, but they've been here longer than anyone could have imagined, and they've adapted to the mansion, using it as their home without anyone noticing. Her words made him shiver. The wealth, security, and perfection he had relied on for decades had been meaningless against this hidden threat. He walked slowly around the room, inspecting the containers and barricades, every polished surface now tainted by the memory of movement, of intelligence he could barely comprehend. Every corner seemed haunted by the memory of those tiny, coordinated creatures. The mansion, which had always been a sanctuary, now felt vulnerable, fragile, and frightening. It was a lesson he could never unlearn. A reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that control was often an illusion. The maid spoke again, her voice calm but filled with gravity. We need to call experts, specialists who understand what we're dealing with, she said. This isn't something we can manage alone, and if we try to ignore it, it will grow, it will spread, and no amount of wealth will protect us from the consequences. The millionaire nodded slowly, swallowing his pride, realizing that her words were the truth. For the first time, he understood that courage, intelligence, and quick thinking mattered far more than money when facing the unknown. They contacted the experts immediately, explaining the situation as best as they could without revealing every horrifying detail. The specialists arrived cautiously, inspecting the hidden tunnels, the barricaded creatures, and the strange metallic objects that had been discovered. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to alarm as they assessed the situation, confirming the maid's worst fears. These creatures were unlike anything they had seen, a combination of biological adaptation and mechanical manipulation. The millionaire watched quietly, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and awe. He realized that his life of luxury and control had shielded him from many dangers, but it had also made him complacent, overconfident, and unaware of the fragile balance of the world around him. The maid, however, had acted with bravery and precision, preventing what could have been a total catastrophe. Her attention to detail, quick thinking, And calm under pressure had saved the mansion, and perhaps even their lives. By the end of the day, the immediate threat had been neutralized, the creatures contained, their tunnels carefully mapped and sealed, and the mansion slowly returned to its former quiet, yet, the millionaire could not shake the memory of the coordinated, intelligent movement he had witnessed. The polished floors, the sparkling chandeliers, the ornate furniture, all had seemed to hide something alive, dangerous, and clever. A reminder that perfection is often an illusion, and that vigilance is essential. Sitting together in the grand living room, the millionaire turned to his maid, gratitude and respect shining in his eyes. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't noticed, if you hadn't acted so quickly," he said. His voice was quiet, sincere, and heavy with emotion. She nodded, offering a small, humble smile, knowing that courage sometimes comes in the smallest, quietest forms, and that attention to detail can make the difference between disaster and survival. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth, control, and pride, had been forever changed. Its halls now held the memory of an unimaginable horror, but also a lesson, a reminder that no matter how powerful or prepared one might be, there are forces beyond comprehension, lurking quietly in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The millionaire understood this now, and for the first time, he felt true respect for vigilance, caution, and the unpredictable nature of life itself.